Hey everyone, how we doing today? This is James Sweeney, aka SplitSuit, and welcome back to another video. And as part of the Ask SplitSuit a Question series, a bunch of people asked hand history questions, and this one actually came via Facebook. And Rich prefaces the hand by saying, first of all, thanks for all your great videos. They have helped me a lot. So here I have a hand I'd like you to review. Not sure if I played it the best possible way. Let's check out the hand. Okay, so in this hand we have queens under the gun, decide to raise, get called by the small blind, get called by the big blind, and the small blind in this situation is a 45-36 over 12, and the big blind is a 26-20 with a 5% 3-bet over 181. Awesome that we have these HUD stats, going to make this hand a lot more interesting. Go here, check, check, here decides to check. So I want to talk about this for a moment because this, in my opinion, is the most important part of the hand, and I feel it went massively overlooked, as it typically does. Oftentimes when we're reviewing hands, people tend to overlook, unfortunately, the most important element of the hand, which is usually like a specific street or a specific size, and these are things that we want to avoid doing, of course. So what I would say in this situation is that the flop is the most important point, because if you check this, what good is going to come of it? So let's just look at things a little bit. I'm going to break this down a little bit nerdy going into the HUD stats. So the big blind, 26-20, 5% 3-bet over a decent sample. If this dude had a big hand, even if he had something like jacks or tens, he's 3-betting this pre-flop, especially when he has position on someone like the small blind. So the big blind just never has a big hand here. And we have two queens in our hand, which massively negates having things like king, queen, and that kind of stuff. So whatever. The big blind is going to get out of this hand so often it's not even funny. Will he occasionally have things like 8-7? Sure. 10-9? Sure. But there's two combos of 10-9 suited, so who cares? So this is just one where the big blind isn't even in my pot, right? If he gets active, he's going to let us know exactly where he's at. It's going to be very, very easy to play against him. So who we really care about here is the small blind. Now, it's only over 12 hands, so 45-36 isn't necessarily the most concrete HUD stats I've ever been given by any stretch because of the small sample size. But this is someone who is shaping up to be pretty active, and because of that, I definitely want to try to get a lot of action from him. If he has something like King 10, I think he's giving me action. Jack X, most certainly. 8X, most certainly. Queen X somehow, most certainly. So let's start getting some money in the middle, right? I don't have any reason to think that I need to check this behind. I have no reason whatsoever to think that. So because of that, fire this. Just bet it for something like 175, 185, go forward from there. Again, the big blind's going to play really, really face up in this spot. The small blind I expect is going to do a lot of check calling, and you can make a lot of really good, easy turn decisions. Without this, check the flop, and then all of a sudden you have no idea where you're at for the rest of the hand, and unfortunately that's kind of what's going to happen here. So the turn comes off a king, the small blind decides to min bet for a quarter, big blind decides to call. Rich, in his write-up, left a little note. He thought that the small blind can essentially min-bet anything. Agree with that. Thought that the big blind would flat here with things like flush draws, two pairs, or even sets. And I massively disagree with that. I think if the big blind had any of those hands, we would hear about them. Or at least if he had things like two-pair sets. And again, I don't really think two-pair are very likely, but sets even less so. I think all of those get 3-bet pre-flop. Again, especially having position on someone like the small blind. So in this situation, here decides to raise. I like that. Definitely happy with it. I think the size could be a little bit bigger, something like 250, 275. Again, the big blind is not even a question here. He has gone so often in this situation, regardless of my size, I don't care about him. The only person I care about is that dude in the small blind who looks like he wants to give me money. That's my main focus here. So again, a little bit larger I think would be better. The small blind actually decides to 3-bet, and here we are. Okay, so I'm going to repeat a piece of advice that I feel like I give a lot of the time. But the reason why I give this advice is because most of the time when people send me hands, the effective stack sizes to start are like 50 to 125 big blinds. And because of those stack sizes, this kind of advice becomes much more commonplace. So the advice I want to give is there are situations similar to this where you have to make your decision, stick with it, and commit to it, and just pull the damn trigger. Okay, so what I mean by that is this. If we decide to call, we're going to have a 1650 pot. We're going to have 15 effective behind. And we already know that if we face a shove on the river, we're going to be getting about 2-1, right? So thinking ahead just a little bit, we already know how this hand is most likely going to play out. So why not have the plan now? The plan could be I'm going to call the turn raise and then I'm going to call off on all rivers. That's a good plan. You're committing to that. One of the worst plans I see is I'm going to call the turn and then evaluate river. Well, why? Right? You're already putting in a decent chunk of money right here. So why not just have the plan for the next street? It makes no sense not to. And I just see too many players are just like, well, I'm going to call here and evaluate later and see what happens. And it's like, no, you can't play poker in like this reactive vacuum. You have to be proactive, particularly as the pot size starts growing really quickly. Now, if you guys were sitting here with like 300 or 400 big blinds effective and there's a lot more play and a lot more options on rivers, I'm not going to say this as much. But you need to be very, very aware of this when you're playing like 100 big blind poker, because it's the kind of situation that comes up a lot on turns, and a lot of players overlook it and put themselves in situations where they call the turn because LOL we have to, and then they have no river plan. And I don't want you to continue making decisions like that because it's a really, really painful place to make decisions from. Super, super reactive, and it's really not a profitable way to play this game. So, with all that being said, what I'm essentially trying to say is whatever your decision is here, whether it's to fold, whether it's to call, whether it's to rip, all of them are committing decisions and you have to commit with it. Now, obviously, if you call here, there's still money left going into the future street, but you have to kind of call with that committing mindset. What are you doing on the next street, and then commit to that. In this situation, that's most likely going to be call turn, call river. That's fine. That's a plan. Is it necessarily the best play? Well, you have to use some hand reading skills to determine that. But like the worst thing you can do is call here, fold rivers because, something, right? I mean, there's no something that can happen that you shouldn't already be prepared for. Now, could you be behind here? Sure, there's ace queen. Now, again, had you bet the flop, all of a sudden that's not as much of an issue and you go forward from there. But I digress. So, could you be behind the free rollers? Things like queen nine of clubs and ace queen of clubs and things like that? Sure. But there aren't very many of them, right? There's ace queen of clubs, king queen of clubs, queen nine of clubs, and then we're probably out of the realm of reasonable queen x suited combos pre-flop. Now, obviously, this dude is shaping up to be a little bit fishy, but it's only 12 hands, and I'm not going to default assume over 12 hands that anyone is going to have something like queen four of clubs in their range. I'm just simply not. Once I get information or confirmation of that, sure, but I'm not going to default make that assumption in such a small sample. Which means, do I really care about clubs on the river? Now, I think that if the small blind had clubs and I decide to raise here to $2, I think he's just going to put in the extra $1.75 and draw at it for cheap. I don't see any reason for someone to min donk here and then come over the top and 3-bet with a flush draw like 5-4 of clubs or something. I just don't see it happening. So I'm going to discount any like non-queen X of clubs kind of hand in terms of the flush draws. So because of that, just make your decision. Either say, okay, I think he's bluffing enough of the time, or I think we have the chop a huge chunk of the time and maybe he has some air, and then go forward from there. But again, make your decision right now. The worst thing you can do is call here, face a bet on the river, and then constantly fold. This is something that a lot of players do, but a lot of players get beat up for it. And I'm not even going to really analyze the river because the river's not that important. What's important is the turn and coming up with that profitable plan right then. Now, one of the notes that Rich sent in his write-up was that he thinks that if the river didn't come a club, he would have called. And I don't want the thought process to involve that think word, right? I think if the river didn't come a club, I would have called. No. The thought process should be if the river wasn't a club, I would have called. Right? It needs to be like concrete, like, okay, if that were the 5 of spades, I'm jamming it in and we're good to go. Not like, well, maybe, right? Because it shouldn't be. It needs to be like a definitive thing. Once you decide to call that turn raise, you need to have that definitive river plan because you already know you're going to be getting roughly 2-1 there. So you need to have that plan in advance. I don't want to see that wishy-washy maybe. Have that definitive plan on the turn, especially when you know that there's a pot size left essentially on rivers. You need to have that plan on the turn. So Rich, thanks for the great hand, and if you or anyone else has a poker-related hand or question, feel free to leave it on our Google Plus page. Leave a link for that in the description box, and also please make sure to like and subscribe if you're enjoying this type of video. If you have any questions, please don't hesitate to let me know. Otherwise, good luck out there, and happy grinding.